Hello students. There's three more geometry facts that we have to learn in this unit, and they all concern parallel lines. So let's get started and have a look at the geometry facts, and then in the following video we'll apply those to find unknown angles. Okay, so here I have two parallel lines right there. They're parallel because they have that little arrowhead on them. And this line that cuts across them is called a transversal. So there's the word just up there. Now, it turns out we have 8 angles in this diagram, but it turns out that 4 of them are equal to each other, and the other 4 are equal to each other. So, angle A we know is 57 degrees, just in there. Well, if angle A is 57 degrees, angle B must be 57 degrees because they're opposite angles. So, angle B is 57 degrees. Angle C, well, C and A add to 180 because they're straight angles. So therefore C must be 123 degrees. Angle D is the same as angle C because they're opposite angles. So that's also 123 degrees. Now if I take this thing and just, drag it down, you can see that these two angles are equal. So therefore, angle A equals angle E. So that's also, angle A equals angle E. That's correct. So angle E is also 57 degrees. Now if E is 57, F is 57. And similarly, if C is 123, G is 123. And if G is 123, H is 123. So the important thing you need to learn from this page here is there's really only two different sized angles when you have two parallel lines cut by a transversal. And half of them are going to be less than 90 degrees, and the other half will be larger than 90 degrees. Unless, of course, the transversal is at 90 degrees to the parallel lines, in which case they're all going to be 90 degrees. So let's go ahead and look at our three geometry facts. Okay, so the first one is saying corresponding angles are equal. So if two parallel lines are cut by a transversal, that angle equals that angle. And that's called the F rule because the diagram looks a little bit like the letter F. They're called corresponding angles because corresponding means they're the same, and both of these are below the parallel lines and to the right of the transversal. So geometry fact number 12, called the F rule. If two parallel lines are cut by a transversal, the corresponding angles are equal. Now it turns out there's 4 different sets of corresponding angles. So there's those two, but there's also that one corresponds to that one. So that looks like an F that's been flipped over. So corresponding angles are equal. You can also have that angle corresponds to that angle. Corresponding angles are equal. And then finally, that angle corresponds to that angle. Corresponding angles are equal. So when you're looking for corresponding angles, that looks a lot like an F. That looks like an F that's been flipped upside down. That one looks like an F that's been flipped left to right, and that one's been flipped both upside down and left to right. But they're all corresponding angles. Okay, the next geometry fact concerns alternate angles, two parallel lines cut by a transversal. Well, that angle there is going to be the same as that angle in there. So I can go ahead and draw that. Angle B is the same as angle E. Again, they're both less than 90 degrees, so we showed that they are equal to each other. Or you can say B is equal to A, E is equal to A, therefore they must be equal to each other. So they're called alternate angles. Alternate means opposite, and these are on opposite sides of the transversal. And that's also called the Z rule because that diagram looks a little bit like a Z. So if two parallel lines just there are cut by a transversal, the alternate angles are equal. Now it turns out there's another pair of alternate angles. This is the pair of alternate angles that are less than 90 degrees. We can also have a look at the alternate angles that are bigger than 90 degrees. So that angle is equal to that angle. So that also is, those also are alternate angles, even though they're not drawn very nicely. Okay, and the last geometry fact has to do with what are called cointerior angles. So co means same, so these two angles are on the same side of the transversal, and interior just means they're on the inside, so they're on the inside of the two parallel lines. Now these angles are not equal to each other. That one's obviously less than 90 degrees. That one's obviously bigger than 90 degrees. So the relationship between those two is those two angles will always add to 180. And I'll show you why that's the case. This is called a geometric proof. So first, I know that these two angles add to 180 because they make a straight angle. So E plus H equals 180 because they add together to make a straight angle. Now I know that H and D are equal because of the corresponding angles. Angle H equals angle D because they're corresponding. Now finally, if that's true, and that's true, we can replace the angle H up there with an angle D, and we get angle D plus angle E equals 180. So these are called cointerior angles, and together they add to 180 degrees. Okay, and this is sometimes called the C rule because that looks like the letter C. If you turn that 90 degrees, it could be called the U rule because it looks like the letter U. Geometry fact 14, if two parallel lines are cut by a transversal, the cointerior angles add to 180. Okay, so there's one pair of cointerior angles, and the other pair of cointerior angles is just drawn on the opposite side of the transversal. So that angle and that angle add to 180. Okay, so now you have three geometry facts about parallel lines. In the next video, we'll use those geometry facts to find the size of unknown angles.